Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for visiting the YouTube channel for bestbiblecommentaries.com. It's Theology Thursday, and in this video, I'm going to be talking about books I used and assigned for a course I teach called Theology of Worship. Before I do that, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and feel free to leave a comment or ask a question down below. Theology of Worship is one of my most favorite courses I have ever taught. I love preparing for it. I loved presenting it, and I loved interacting with my students. The level that I taught it at was an undergraduate college students, and it was an upper division course. So I think a few of the books I show you, I think might be better for a seminary level, but others I think would be great for lay people and are more introductory in nature. So I'll make a distinction between those as we move along here. So one thing I wanted to mention before I talk about the first book is what books of the Bible I spent a lot of time talking about in this course, because perhaps that might be of interest to some of you. I spent a lot of time in the book of Leviticus, the book of Revelation, and also Hebrews. Now, throughout every class, just as the subject matter for that day dictated, we were in and out of a lot of books of the Bible, but I spent an awful lot of time in those three books as we explored the topic of worship in the Bible. And by worship, I just don't mean music or singing. That was a part of our conversation, but that was not all of our conversation, because I don't think the Bible uses worship that narrowly. It's certainly part of it. I'm not saying anything negative about that, but I know that some theology of worship courses at different schools are just about music and singing, and I took a little bit different approach. So that's going to help explain why I picked these resources. So the first resource I'm showing you, I did not assign, but I have it in my library to consult. It's called Worship by the Book. D.A. Carson's the editor. This book, there are 4 essays in this book. One is by D.A. Carson, talking about worship according to Scripture. It's about 50 pages long. Mark Ashton, who I'm not that familiar with. R. Kent Hughes, who you might be familiar with if you like the Preaching the Word commentary series. He has a lot of volumes in that series. And of course, Timothy Keller, former pastor at Redeemer in New York City. Partly this is in my library in my worship section because I'll read anything that D.A. Carson writes. R. Kent Hughes and Tim Keller are great too, but pretty much anything D.A. Carson writes I want in my library. This is a little bit more introductory, but the subject matter is pretty narrow. So one essay is about worship in free churches, one is about worship in Reformed churches. And then, like I said, D.A. Carson's about worship according to Scripture. So it's helpful information, but I never really seriously considered assigning it to undergraduate students because I thought there were resources that may be a little bit better. Another resource that I used but did not end up assigning is this book by Ronald Allen called The Wonder of Worship, A New Understanding of the Worship Experience. I do think this is a good resource for lay people or undergraduate college students. Ronald Allen has written several books on worship, and he's also written a commentary on Numbers in the Expositor's Bible Commentary series. I think he might have a couple more commentaries as well, but that's the one that comes to mind for me. This is part of a theology series. I think Dallas Theological Seminary might have put it out. There's a foreword here by Charles Swindoll. It's a little bit dated. It's maybe 25 years old or so. It's a good introduction to worship ministry in the church, but I was taking a little bit different approach with my class. So some of the chapter titles are Leading in Worship, Getting Ready for Worship, The Biblical Role of Worship, Mere Ritual or True Worship, ? So there's good, helpful information in here. And if someone's new to worship ministry, or maybe you're part of a worship team of some sort at your church, I think this would be a great resource. And I'm happy that I have it in my library. This is a book, if I could I assigned 2 books. I had my students in this class do a lot of reading out of the Bible, and so I only ended up signing 2 textbooks. If I did assign a 3rd textbook, it would have been this one from the Counterpoint series, 6 Views on Exploring the Worship Spectrum. And the 6 views are formal liturgical worship, traditional hymn-based worship, contemporary music-driven worship, charismatic worship, blended worship, and immersion worship. So if you're familiar with this series, and you might be if you've been watching my channel, because I really enjoy this series. I really love cordial conversation about theological, biblical ministry differences. I really enjoy that. So I really like this series. So if you want to read a discussion about that and learn some of these other approaches and perspectives, this is a great resource. I think this kind of series is perfect for undergraduates. I've assigned several other books out of this series for different classes that I've taught. But I chose two other ones, and I'll show you those in a minute. So, but for your consideration, Exploring the Worship Spectrum. This one I really like. I cannot find a place to put this in my teaching yet, but when I teach at Theology of Worship again, I'm sure I'll consider this because I really like this book, but it's a little bit narrower in scope. So it is called New Testament Christological Hymns, Exploring Text, Context, and Significance by Matthew Gordley, who is at Carlow University, previously taught at Regent University. So actually some good blurbs on here. L.W. Hurtado, David De Silva, David Yoon. So there are different hymns in the New Testament. We might think of, well-known hymns in the book of Philippians, the book of Colossians. So this is an exploration of the different hymns in the New Testament. And as hymns, of course, their nature is worship, but they also teach theological truth as well. There might be some of you who will recognize chapter and verse and not realize that most scholars actually think that that's an early hymn. So really fascinating study, and I love it. I love that someone wrote a book about that. It's just pretty narrow in scope. Might be better for a seminary class on worship, or I think there's a couple of other kind of readers that would be interested in this. One is if you're interested in the history of, kind of the composition of the New Testament, but also I think it has an apologetic appeal as well, because the hymns, most scholars believe that these hymns date from very, very early. So just take example, the hymn that's found in Philippians chapter 2. Well, that was probably being sung and existed. It was written before Philippians was written, so it dates earlier. So it's just fast. The content, just studying the content of those hymns, it's just a fascinating study. And I really, I would call it probably more of a mid-level book. I was going to say I recommend it to everybody, but it is probably more mid-level. So it's probably geared more toward pastors and professors. So I'm not sure. Probably just depends on your experience reading biblical studies materials, if a layperson would be interested and really benefit from it. But I really benefit from it, so I thought I would mention it. Here is another one that I think is better suited for seminary students, but I did use it in the class. I didn't assign it to students, but I used it because I think it was really helpful. It's called We Become What We Worship, subtitle A Biblical Theology of Idolatry by G.K. Beal. And of course, there's a picture of the golden calf on there. So you say, well, why would you talk about idolatry in a worship class? And I actually ended up talking about idolatry quite a bit. I talk about idolatry quite a bit in this class because in many ways, biblically, it's the opposite of worship. And so it's just a fascinating study. And G.K. Beal does, as he always does, just a tremendous job with this topic. We become what we worship. It's just an amazing concept to think through. This is definitely mid-level, so just a fair warning if you might want to start with another resource, but it is a fascinating read. So there's the origin of, here's some chapter examples. A foundational example of becoming like what we worship from Isaiah 6, the origin of idolatry in the Old Testament. Becoming like what we worship, Judaism. Becoming like what we worship, the Gospels. And then there's a chapter on the idolatry in the book of Acts. Becoming like what we worship in Paul's epistles. Becoming like what we worship in the book of Revelation. In a conclusion, what difference does it make? So some application there as well. If you're a worship pastor, I would recommend this. I really like it. It might take some people a little bit longer to read and just kind of digest, but it's a really excellent resource. Its blurb has some great recommendations from some well-known commentary authors: Frank Thielman, Bruce Waltke, Thomas Schreiner, Douglas Stewart, T. Desmond Alexander. So just excellent recommendations as well. All right, the 2 books I assigned for Theology of Worship. One is called Unceasing Worship, Biblical Perspectives on Worship and the Arts by Harold Best. And Harold Best was at Wheaton College for many years. The reason why I picked the two books I did to assign is because I thought they did a good job of going into biblical and theological depth and also helping readers understand the significance for it for their own lives. And that's really what I wanted my undergraduates to take away from the course. So there's 2 parts in this book: Unceasing Worship as Continuing Outpouring. A couple chapter examples: Nobody does not worship. Another one: What is authentic worship? Chapter 6 is Worship, Praying, and Preaching. And then part 2 is Unceasing Worship and the Arts: What creative people can learn from God's creation. Continuous outpouring and artistic action. The peculiarity of music and its unique role. Quote, You shall not worship me this way. Worship, art, and incipient idolatry. So, really interesting book. And it led to a lot of conversations, not just about music, but about artistic expression in church services and in literature. It's really an excellent read. There was, I'll have to say, a little bit of overlap between Best and this one I'm going to show you now by David Peterson, but at this point, when I teach it again, I probably will stay with these 2 books. So this is might be my personal favorite book on worship by David Peterson, and some of you will be familiar with him. He has written commentaries on Acts, comes to mind. Acts, some other ones I just can't quite remember. Engaging with God, A Biblical Theology of Worship by David Peterson. I had my students spend a lot of time with this book, writing reflections on this book, answering questions about what Peterson was trying to say. I just think it's very good. Forward by I. Howard Marshall. Some of you will be familiar with him. Part 1 is called Engaging with the God of the New Testament. Part 2 is called Honoring, Serving, and Respecting God. And then a couple other examples are Jesus and the New Temple, Paul and the Service of the Gospel, the Book of Hebrews and the Worship of Jesus, and Worship in the Revelation to John. Really outstanding book. I think this would be great for worship pastors. I think lay people who are involved in worship ministry would benefit from this book. Would a lay person who doesn't participate in worship ministry benefit from this book? Yes, it's certainly going to be edifying, and it's a great Bible study on the topic of worship. It's a little bit more in depth, though. I don't think I would go so far as to say it's a mid-level resource like the Beal book is, but there's a lot of depth to it. So don't be surprised if it takes you a little bit longer to get through some of the chapters and to think through the material. But has a very high recommendation from me. So thanks for watching. I hope this video has been helpful in some level, and I'll see you next time.